Well, the Chancellor of the Exchequer has been in West Yorkshire today talking about his big plan to speed up house building. At the end of last week he announced he's reforming the planning system, to make it simpler for building applications to be granted.
Now, one of the most radical proposals is to introduce a system which would see planning permission granted automatically for housing schemes on brownfield land. That's land that's previously been built on. He's been on such a site in Morley today. Charlotte Leeming reports.
The Chancellor, George Osborne, getting stuck in on a rain-soaked building site in Morley.
Natural.
He was getting his hands dirty to announce the government's latest plan to try and solve the housing crisis. Sweeping reforms of the planning system, which will give automatic planning permission to developers who want to build on brownfield land.
This was a disused mill, and look, it's being turned into a place where some great family homes are being built. I want to see homes built that people can buy. That's the priority. Of course, it's part of a budget package with a new national living wage, with tax cuts for working people here.
It's councillors like Richard Lewis who will be asked to implement these changes. So does he think the Chancellor's new productivity plan is the best way to get people on the property ladder?
I do think the government just misunderstands the housing market. It's not about that bottleneck of land or the planning system. It's actually about the developers and how fast they want to build. And I don't think there's ever been a time when developers will build to meet need. They will build to meet demand, and that demand for them is the one that actually gives them a decent profit.
The Chancellor wants Yorkshire to be more productive. He wants councils like Leeds to build more family homes and much quicker. He wants every available brownfield site used, but what happens when those brownfield sites run out? Across Aireborough there have been protests from residents trying to stop developments going ahead, not only to protect greenbelt, but over fears there isn't the infrastructure in place to cope. Dramatically speeding up the planning process could put Mr Osborne on a collision course with local communities.
People don't just live in houses, they live in communities. Communities need facilities. Communities need to feel that they're happy in the place that they live. Otherwise, it's no point in developers building the houses because people end up not wanting to live out there.
I think the government's efforts to unlock development on brownfield sites are to be welcomed, but I also like to see more power to local communities to challenge and make sure that we're making the right decisions about housing and planning.
But whatever the fears over this planning system shake-up, the Chancellor is drilling home this message to councils. Get Yorkshire building and do it sooner rather than later. Charlotte Leeming, BBC Look North, Leeds.
Well, earlier I spoke to John Stewart from the Home Builders Federation. He said the current planning laws were too lengthy and expensive.
Well, we're very pleased. The whole planning system has become extremely complex and costly over the years, and the government has now recognised that, and it wants to simplify things, and that's got to be good for. It'll be good for local planning authorities because they won't have to find quite such large resources to run the system, and it'll be good for house builders.
We know we need more houses now, so what's stopping building happening straight away?
Well, the problem over the last few years has been mortgages, but of course that situation has eased somewhat, and we have the Help to Buy scheme, which means you can buy with a 5% deposit. That's had an enormous effect. Over the longer term, it's been a lot to do with planning, and over the last 25 years or so, planning has become more and more complex and more costly, and so the government's recognition of that and the barrier that's causing is very welcome.
So these changes will be coming in the summer. What's stopping them happening before then?
Well, my understanding is that some of them will require legislation, so they won't even be able to come in the summer. Some of them will require changes to guidance. There will be various legal requirements attached to them, so they can't be done overnight. I wish they could be, but I don't really think that's feasible.
Campaigners are concerned about greenbelt and greenfield land being involved at some point. There's no real way of avoiding that, is there?
Well, greenbelt is a very different kettle of fish because that's a very specific designation, and there's very little building in greenbelt. Greenfield is different. We try and build as much as we can on brownfield. About 3/4 of all new housing is built on brownfield at the moment. But at the end of the day, we need to roughly double our housing output per year, and clearly we can't do all of that on brownfield, so there will be some greenfield involved. But greenbelt, as I say, is a very different thing.
So greenfield sites will be used at some point, and campaigners are very concerned about that.
Yes, there will have to be some greenfield land, and it's a trade-off really. It's a question, do we protect every blade of grass on every greenfield site, or do we provide housing for the people of this country, particularly for young people? It's the young people who are suffering most from the shortage of housing and the very high cost of housing that comes along because of the shortage.
Will the right type of houses be built?
Well, house builders will always build the appropriate sort of housing depending on the local market. So if they're building in an area where prices are relatively cheap, they would probably build homes that would be suitable for first-time buyers, whereas, say, for example, in a road where there are very expensive houses, they'll tend to build the housing that suits that particular area. So there's no blanket rule. They will fit the local market and the local demand.
John Stewart from the Home Builders Federation speaking with me earlier. Before 7 o'clock.
Sheffield's James Crisp.